Rob Reiner has always been the kind of Hollywood name that feels set in stone. A director with a legacy, a public voice, and decades of credibility. Someone people assume has everything organized, protected, and quietly settled behind closed doors. That's exactly why the headline-style claim that his $200 million fortune distribution shocks Hollywood hits so hard. Not because wealth is rare in Los Angeles, but because when a figure like Reiner becomes the center of an inheritance conversation, it signals that something about the structure, the beneficiaries, or the conditions is not what the public expects. Start with the number itself. $200 million is the kind of figure that travels fast because it's simple and dramatic. But in celebrity culture, net worth is often an estimate, an umbrella number that can include real estate value, production interests, residual streams, and long-term intellectual property income. That matters because estates don't distribute a number. They distribute assets, and assets come with paperwork, restrictions, and sometimes invisible tripwires. Those tripwires are where the shock usually lives. Hollywood fans tend to imagine inheritance like a movie scene. A will is read, everyone gasps, and money gets assigned like prize totals. Real life is closer to corporate governance than courtroom drama. For high-profile families, it's common to use trusts, LLCs, and layered ownership structures that keep things private and controlled. If Reiner's estate planning follows that pattern, the public may never see a clean list of who got what. Yet rumors still erupt, because the absence of public clarity creates the perfect vacuum for speculation. And speculation always picks the same targets: spouses, children, estranged relatives, and anyone who's been the subject of tabloid chatter. Here is what can realistically cause a Hollywood-shocking distribution without requiring any outlandish conspiracy. One possibility is conditional inheritance. A trust can be designed so that heirs don't receive large sums outright. Instead, distributions might be staged, released at certain ages, tied to education milestones, health needs, or long-term stability. This can look brutal from the outside. Someone got cut off. But in practice, it can be protective, especially in families where public pressure, predators, and financial mismanagement are constant risks. In a celebrity context, even a normal safeguard can be spun into scandal. Another possibility is the philanthropy surprise. When a public figure has spent years supporting civic causes, early childhood development, community programs, or political advocacy, it's not unusual for a meaningful share of wealth to be earmarked for charitable giving. If the estate prioritizes foundations or long-term donations, that can trigger outrage online because audiences are conditioned to treat inheritance as a family-only event. In reality, some celebrities treat their estate as their final public statement. To fans and industry watchers expecting a pure family split, a heavy philanthropic allocation can feel like a shock, even if it was planned for years. Then there's the intellectual property twist, which is where Hollywood estates can get complicated fast. A director's wealth isn't always cash. It can be back-end points, royalties, rights participation, production company equity, and long-lived residual streams tied to films that will keep earning for decades. Those assets might be distributed unevenly. One heir receives property, another receives investment accounts, and another receives revenue rights. That kind of distribution can be fair in value while looking unequal on paper, which fuels exactly the sort of drama HLLW audiences expect. But the biggest reason estate stories explode is the possibility of legal disqualification. In California and many jurisdictions, there are laws that can prevent a person from inheriting if they are found responsible for causing the death of the person they would inherit from. This concept, often called a Slayer rule, doesn't exist to create headlines. It exists to prevent a moral and legal absurdity, someone profiting from wrongdoing. The moment public chatter connects an inheritance story to that kind of statute, the narrative shifts from who gets money to who is legally allowed to get money. That's the kind of shift that makes Hollywood go silent, because the implications are no longer gossip, they're structural. And then there's the quiet detail that turns family grief into public chaos: timing. If two spouses die close together, or if there are questions around sequence of death, estate plans can function differently than people assume. Some documents contain survivorship clauses. Some trusts treat near simultaneous death as a special category. Those technicalities can redirect inheritances in ways that look shocking, even if they're standard planning tools. So what is the most responsible way to read the headline claim? Not as confirmed numbers or a verified distribution chart, but as a signal that the usual Hollywood script isn't matching what observers think is happening. When people say "shocks Hollywood," what they often mean is this: the estate isn't a simple family payout. The structure is unusually strict, the beneficiaries aren't obvious, or the legal context adds uncertainty that the public wasn't prepared for. In other words, the shock is not the fortune. The shock is the design. And that is exactly why this kind of story spreads. Because in a city built on image, an estate plan is the one place where image cannot negotiate. It only executes. And when an estate plan only executes, it exposes something Hollywood rarely admits out loud. Behind the glamour, wealth is not a pile of money. It is a network of contracts, entities, and obligations. That's why the most explosive moments in inheritance stories are often not about greed. They're about control. Who controls the trust? Who controls the companies? Who controls the intellectual property? Who gets to say yes or no when an heir asks for funds? That's where a legacy can quietly change hands even while the public is distracted by a headline number. If Rob Reiner's fortune is as large as the online estimates suggest, it's highly likely that at least part of it is held in structures designed to avoid the public probate process. California probate can be slow, expensive, and extremely public. A revocable living trust, paired with LLC ownership for properties and business interests, can keep sensitive details out of the spotlight. To the public, that privacy looks suspicious. Why won't they release the will? But to estate planners, it's standard practice. The problem is that standard practice does not make for a satisfying story. And when audiences don't get a satisfying story, they write their own. This is where distribution shocks Hollywood becomes a perfect rumor engine. Because if the public doesn't see a straightforward probate filing, the narrative becomes, someone is hiding something, someone is being protected, someone is being punished. People begin reading silence as confession. Even normal legal steps, like appointing a trustee, freezing certain accounts, or waiting for valuations, can be misinterpreted as drama. But the estate world has its own tempo. It moves at the speed of paperwork, not headlines. Still, shocks can happen. Real ones. One shock is the possibility of a professional trustee rather than a family member. Many people assume the eldest child or a spouse's relative will manage the trust. But wealthy families sometimes appoint a bank trust department, a trust company, or a seasoned attorney as trustee to prevent internal warfare and to maintain neutrality. That decision can feel like a slap to family members who expected influence. In Hollywood terms, it reads like betrayal. They didn't trust their own family. In legal terms, it can be the smartest move possible. Another shock is the rise of no-contest clauses and litigation deterrence. Some estate plans include provisions that reduce or eliminate a beneficiary's share if they challenge the trust. The purpose is simple: stop opportunistic lawsuits. The effect is dramatic. People who believe they were wronged may stay silent, because speaking up could cost them everything. That kind of forced quiet can look like guilt, even when it's just strategy. Then there's the uncomfortable truth. Inheritance can be shaped by relationship history more than blood. Estates often reward caregivers, long-term loyal staff, or specific individuals who provided support during difficult years. The public hears, "Housekeeper got millions," and calls it scandal. Estate planners call it gratitude and compensation for loyalty. If a large gift goes outside the immediate family, the internet will call it shocking, even if it was carefully documented for years. But the darkest kind of shock, the one that turns a normal estate into a high-voltage conversation, comes from the intersection of inheritance and criminal allegations. When there is any public suggestion that a person connected to the family could be legally disqualified from inheriting, the stakes change immediately. A Slayer statute does not need to be proven in headlines to influence behavior. Families often take precautions the moment the possibility is raised. Trustees become conservative, distributions pause, access tightens, and legal counsel becomes the default voice in every decision. Even beneficiaries who are completely uninvolved can feel the consequences because the estate must protect itself from future claims. This is also why distribution can look delayed, chaotic, or secretive from the outside. People expect immediate answers. Estates often can't provide them, not without risking legal exposure. Another practical reason distribution can shock Hollywood is simple: tax planning and asset valuation. Big estates sometimes involve extensive appraisals, especially for real estate in Los Angeles, production company holdings, or rights-based income streams. A property that fans assume is worth one number may be valued differently after appraisal. A revenue stream may be discounted based on risk. An asset may have debt attached that the public never knew existed. When the final accounting emerges, the real, transferable value can be wildly different from the headline net worth. That difference alone can shock casual observers. Where did the money go? The answer is usually not scandal. It's structure. And there's one more factor that Hollywood hates discussing because it ruins the fantasy. Sometimes an estate plan is designed to minimize emotional damage, not maximize equal shares. A parent might leave more to one child because that child has medical needs. Another might receive less because they already received significant support during life, education, housing, business opportunities, things that never show up in the public narrative. Unequal inheritance can look like punishment when it's actually an attempt at balance. So where does that leave the story? It leaves it exactly where HLLW thrives, in the tension between what the public wants, a clear villain, a clear victim, a dramatic reading of the will, and what estate reality delivers: clauses, contingents, trustees, and legal thresholds. The shock is rarely one single bombshell. It's a slow reveal that the fortune is not a gift basket. It's a machine. And once that machine is switched on, it doesn't care about rumors, optics, or Hollywood tradition. If the Reiner fortune story continues to trend, it won't be because people love estate planning. It will be because inheritance forces audiences to confront something unsettling. Fame can create power, but death creates a system, one that decides winners and losers with cold precision. And in a city built on storytelling, nothing is more frightening than a story you can't rewrite. At this point, the conversation stops being about money and starts being about narrative control. Because in celebrity estates, the public is not reacting to spreadsheets. They are reacting to what the spreadsheet implies: who is trusted, who is protected, who is managed, and who is kept at a distance. That is why even the smallest credible detail, a trustee appointment, a delayed distribution, a reported amendment date on a trust, can ignite a wildfire of interpretation. And the interpretation follows a predictable pattern. First comes the myth of the simple will. People assume there is a single document in a safe, a dramatic reading, and a clean split. In reality, a major estate often includes multiple instruments: a pour-over will, a revocable living trust, assignment schedules, property deeds, beneficiary designations for retirement accounts and insurance, and operating agreements for entities that hold assets. Each piece can override or bypass another. That complexity creates the illusion of contradiction when it is really just modular planning. Then comes the myth of instant distribution. Fans see fortune and imagine speed. But estates move through verification and valuation. Assets must be identified, appraised, and legally transferred. Creditors may have windows to make claims. Taxes and administrative costs have to be calculated. Even when everything is peaceful, trustees often distribute conservatively at first. It is normal for initial steps to look like silence, because silence is the only posture that doesn't create legal exposure. But here's the pivot point where Hollywood shock becomes plausible. Once there is any public controversy, whether it is a family dispute, a high-profile separation, a contested claim, or simply conflicting media narratives, the estate stops being a family matter and becomes a risk management operation. Every decision is made to withstand scrutiny, not to satisfy curiosity. That's when trustees lock down communication, attorneys become the primary voice, and beneficiaries learn that access is not a right. It is a process. If you want to understand the kind of distribution twist that truly stuns Hollywood insiders, focus on three mechanisms: exclusion, control, and conditioning. Exclusion is the blunt instrument. It can happen through disinheritance language, through a beneficiary being omitted, or through a structure that makes someone technically included but practically sidelined. For example, a person might be named as a beneficiary but only through a subtrust that pays for limited categories: housing, health, education, without ever handing over principal. To outsiders, it looks like they got nothing. In reality, they got a control pipeline. Control is the quieter instrument, and in many ways, the more brutal one. Control can live in trustee powers. It can live in who holds voting rights in an LLC. It can live in who controls intellectual property decisions, licensing, catalog management, approvals for documentaries, biopics, or memoir rights. A beneficiary may receive value but not voice. Hollywood understands voice. It understands who gets to greenlight projects, who gets to approve archival usage, who controls the story after death. When control is separated from inheritance, that is when even wealthy beneficiaries can feel powerless, and that power dynamic is exactly the kind of thing insiders whisper about. Conditioning is where the estate becomes a mirror of family history. Conditioning can include milestones, behavioral requirements, or triggers that pause distributions. It can also include incentive trust features, matching earned income, supporting career development, funding therapy or rehabilitation, or acquiring financial education before major releases. From a planning standpoint, these are stabilizers. From a tabloid standpoint, they are accusations written in legal language. The internet reads conditions as judgments. They didn't trust him. They were afraid of her. They thought she'd waste it. Conditions invite story-making because they imply a private truth. Now, add the final accelerant: perceived unfairness. People do not rage because a fortune is complicated. They rage because they believe the complexity is being used to reward loyalty and punish dissent. The moment one heir appears favored, receiving property, steady income, decision-making authority, while another appears restricted, the public starts filling in blanks with the oldest Hollywood archetypes: the golden child, the scapegoat, the black sheep, the outsider. Whether those labels are fair is almost irrelevant. What matters is that the estate plan becomes a stage for a family drama the public feels entitled to watch. And that entitlement is what makes headlines so dangerous. Because when you do not have confirmed court documents, you get a counterfeit certainty. People speak in absolutes based on partial information. They treat net worth estimates like verified account balances. They treat rumored clauses like scanned legal pages. They treat anonymous claims like sworn testimony. That's why responsible coverage has to keep one sentence in the foreground. Most estate details are private unless they enter a public probate dispute. Still, HLLW isn't about pretending the emotional reality doesn't exist. The emotional reality is exactly what makes estates combustible. Even in families without scandal, inheritance can reopen old wounds. Who felt seen? Who felt ignored? Who carried responsibility? Who escaped it? When real estate, royalties, and control rights are laid out in black and white, people aren't just reading numbers. They're reading a final message from someone who is no longer here to clarify intentions. And that is where the shock narrative becomes believable in a broader sense. The estate can function like a verdict. Not a legal verdict, an emotional one. If this story continues to trend, the next phase will likely look like this: new insider claims, conflicting interpretations, and a public that confuses speculation with confirmation. But behind the noise, the estate will be doing what estates always do: moving slowly, defensively, and methodically, prioritizing enforceability over image. Because in Hollywood, image is flexible. Contracts are not. Trust language is not. Beneficiary designations are not. The final twist is that the fortune may not be the centerpiece at all. The centerpiece may be the controls around the fortune. Who can speak, who can decide, who can access, and who must wait. And for a culture that equates money with freedom, waiting is the most shocking outcome of all. What makes a fortune distribution story so addictive is that it sits at the intersection of two obsessions, money and meaning. People do not only want to know who inherits. They want to know what inheritance says about love, disappointment, loyalty, regret, and the private hierarchy a public figure never admitted while alive. That's why a headline like Rob Reiner's $200 million fortune distribution shocks Hollywood doesn't need confirmed paperwork to travel. It plugs into a universal suspicion that the real truth of a family is hidden in the fine print. And in Hollywood, the fine print is always thicker than the script. The next layer the public rarely understands is that the most important inheritance may not be dollars at all. It may be a set of rights. Rights to decide how a name is used. Rights to approve a documentary. Rights to license clips. Rights to publish or block a memoir. Rights to control archival material, correspondence, and private recordings. Those rights can be assigned to one person, a committee, or a professional fiduciary. The moment control of legacy is separated from control of cash, you get a new kind of tension. Someone can be wealthy but still powerless, while another can be less wealthy but hold the keys to the story. That imbalance is the kind of thing that quietly stuns insiders, because it determines who can shape the narrative for decades. This is also where the public's idea of fairness collapses. Fairness in a family is emotional. Fairness in an estate is structural. An estate can be equal on paper and still feel brutal because it ignores history. Or it can be unequal on paper and be the most balanced outcome possible because it reflects support already given during life. The problem is that outsiders don't know the history. They only see the outcome. They see one heir in a house, another in a trust, another with royalties, another with conditions. They assume favoritism. They assume betrayal. They assume someone must have done something to deserve less. That assumption is gasoline. Then there is the category of shocks that are not moral at all, just procedural. For example, if a large portion of wealth is tied up in property or long-term income streams, the immediate distributions may look modest. A trust may be rich but cash poor, especially at the beginning of administration. Trustees often prioritize liquidity planning, which can mean selling assets, refinancing, or simply waiting for scheduled revenues. To the public, it looks like, where is the fortune? But fortunes aren't always liquid. They're often locked inside assets that take time to move without losing value. And time is the enemy of public perception. The longer it takes, the louder the theories become. At this stage, most HLLW-style narratives try to find a villain. The villain could be a person, but it can also be a role. The trustee, the attorney, the advisor, the handler. The idea that someone else is steering the estate behind the scenes is a classic Hollywood fear because it suggests the family doesn't own its own decisions. But even there, the truth is more boring and more unsettling. Trustees are legally required to act in the best interests of beneficiaries, and best interests can be conservative, slow, and unpopular. A trustee does not exist to make people feel better. A trustee exists to make the plan survive challenges. So if Hollywood is shocked, one realistic reason is that the plan is unusually hardened against challenge. Hardened plans come with thicker documentation, stronger no-contest clauses, tighter trustee discretion, and clearer definitions of what qualifies as a permissible distribution. Those tools are used when a person anticipates conflict, pressure, or manipulation. And that anticipation itself becomes a story. People read hard planning as paranoia. They read it as fear. They read it as a sign that something was unstable long before the headlines arrived. But the most quietly devastating shock is when the plan is not dramatic at all, when it is painfully calm. Calm estate planning can feel like a rejection of the public's appetite for closure. If the plan routes most assets into long-term trusts, sets modest monthly or quarterly distributions, funds philanthropic commitments, and assigns legacy decisions to professionals, the public gets no climax. There is no single gotcha moment. There is only a slow, controlled transfer of power. That is often how sophisticated estates are designed, to deny chaos oxygen. Yet the public will still call it shocking, because it violates the fantasy that celebrity equals access. The fantasy is, if someone is famous, the world will eventually know their secrets. Trusts are the opposite of that fantasy. Trusts are privacy architecture. They are built to make secrets stay secrets. That's why these stories often end up morphing into a different question. Not who inherited, but who was left out. Being left out can mean being disinherited, but it can also mean being moved to the margins, receiving benefits without authority, support without autonomy, access without trust. And nothing humiliates a public figure's circle faster than the idea that the final plan doesn't align with the public image of unity. A public image can be managed. A legal structure is harder to spin. One more factor turns this from gossip into a long-term saga. Media ecosystems reward updates, even when nothing is legally confirmed. Every filing, every alleged insider quote, every rumor about a clause becomes part two. The audience becomes trained to interpret ordinary administrative steps as plot progression. A valuation becomes a delay. A trustee appointment becomes a takeover. A confidentiality request becomes a cover-up. And once that framing is set, every normal estate step is reinterpreted as drama. So if you want the HLLW core truth, it's this. The shock is rarely a single distribution choice. The shock is the realization that wealth does not automatically produce freedom, and that legacy is not automatically controlled by the loudest family member. The shock is that the final design can be colder than anyone expected, not because the person lacked love, but because they understood what fame does to families when money is involved. In the end, the fortune becomes a mirror, and mirrors don't comfort. They reveal. They reveal who gets to decide, who must comply, who can wait without breaking, and who cannot. And in a culture addicted to instant outcomes, the most dramatic twist is not scandal. It is structure, quiet, enforceable structure, executing exactly as written while the world argues over what it must mean. And once you accept that the shock is structure, you start noticing how the structure behaves like a living thing, tightening when it senses danger, expanding when it senses stability, and staying absolutely silent when the outside world demands answers. That silence is not emptiness. It is a strategy. In the estate world, silence is what you do when every sentence can become evidence, when every casual remark can be framed as intent, and when every family member's emotion can be converted into leverage. So the more the internet screams for clarity, the more a competent estate administration retreats behind formal channels, because formal channels are the only place where meaning is controlled. That's why the most consequential moments often happen off camera. A trustee meeting, a legal memo, a valuation report, a quiet signature on an assignment of rights. The public wants a spectacle, but the estate is built to survive spectacle, not feed it. And that mismatch creates the exact tension HLLW thrives on. The public is chasing drama, while the estate is executing procedure, and procedure can feel like cruelty when you don't understand what it's protecting. Here's the uncomfortable part. Sometimes the estate is protecting beneficiaries from themselves. Not in a judgmental way, but in a practical way. Wealth can amplify instability, and the most expensive mistakes are made quickly. Impulsive purchases, predatory relationships, opportunistic friends, and business deals that look like dreams until they turn into lawsuits. A cautious plan anticipates that. It puts friction between a beneficiary and a bad decision. It makes access slower, more documented, more supervised. Friction is the enemy of thrill, but the friend of survival. To an audience trained on instant gratification, friction reads like punishment. To a planner, friction is mercy disguised as bureaucracy. This is why a trust can be simultaneously generous and restrictive. It can pay for housing, health, education, reasonable support, even security, while refusing to hand over principal in a way that can be drained in months. It can fund a life without funding self-destruction. But you can imagine how the internet interprets that. They don't trust him. They don't respect her. They're controlling them from the grave. And once that interpretation catches, it doesn't matter how rational the structure is, it becomes a moral story. The other pressure point is perception of influence. When a professional fiduciary or attorney becomes the face of administration, people assume manipulation. In reality, professionals are often brought in when the deceased knew that family dynamics could fracture under stress. A professional trustee is an attempt to remove emotion from decisions that will otherwise be soaked in emotion. Yet that neutrality can feel icy. It can make grief feel like a transaction. And in celebrity families, where public identity is part of the family ecosystem, transaction is an especially harsh word. Still, neutrality has a purpose. It keeps the estate from becoming a battleground where the loudest person wins. It forces disagreements into legal form, where they can be resolved by rules rather than power plays. That is the hidden reason Hollywood is shocked. Narrative spread. The industry is used to deals made through relationships and persuasion, but trusts are not impressed by charisma. Trusts are impressed by terms. If a beneficiary expected to negotiate based on closeness, reputation, or emotional appeal, and instead encountered a trustee who only responds to written requests and documented needs, that collision can feel like betrayal, even if it is entirely consistent with the plan. Then there's the question nobody likes to say out loud. What happens when the estate plan is designed to outlive not just the person, but the family's ability to get along? Some plans are built for decades. They create dynastic trusts, multi-generational vehicles, charitable legs, and entity governance that can survive marriages, divorces, feuds, and fame cycles. That kind of long horizon can feel shocking because it reframes the fortune from a family payout into a family institution. Institutions have policies. Institutions have gatekeepers. Institutions don't apologize. If the Reiner fortune conversation has the shape of an institution rather than a payout, that alone would explain why observers describe it as stunning. It means the legacy is being treated as something to preserve, not something to distribute quickly. And once legacy becomes preservation, the next fight is almost always about narrative assets. What can be said, what can be published, what can be licensed, what can be monetized, and who gets to approve it. The public often assumes that the family automatically owns the story. But a well-planned estate can assign story control in specific ways, and those assignments can cut against expectations. One person may have the right to approve projects, while others simply receive income. One entity may hold archival material, while individuals are restricted by confidentiality clauses. If there are NDAs, settlement terms, or private agreements connected to the deceased's business life, those can bind beneficiaries in ways that feel suffocating. That's another reason estates shock Hollywood. The public forgets that entertainment is contract-heavy, and contracts don't dissolve just because the person is gone. They become part of the estate's obligations. Add insurance, creditor claims, and ongoing business commitments, and you begin to see how fortune can be less like a treasure chest and more like a complicated company. Now, imagine being an heir inside that machine. Imagine grieving while lawyers ask for signatures. Imagine reading about your family in headlines while being advised to say nothing. Imagine your own life becoming content for strangers while you're not allowed to correct a single rumor without risking legal blowback. In that environment, even a fair distribution can feel like a prison because it comes wrapped in restrictions, processes, and silence. That is the HLLW heart of it. The public thinks inheritance is freedom, but in high-profile estates, inheritance can be a controlled corridor with cameras on both sides. People outside call it shocking. People inside call it Tuesday. And the final twist, the one that makes these stories linger, is that the estate's design may be the last honest thing the public ever sees. Public life is performance. Estate planning is often private truth translated into enforceable terms. Not perfect truth, not always kind truth, but structured truth. If the structure looks colder, stricter, or more complicated than fans expected, it may simply mean the person understood something fans didn't. That love and money are not the same instrument, and if you use money to communicate love, you may destroy both. So the plan chooses durability over comfort, and it accepts that people will call it shocking because people always call boundaries shocking when they expected access. And that expectation of access is exactly what turns an estate into a cultural battlefield. Because celebrity is not just fame. It's a relationship the public feels it owns. People watch films, quote lines, follow interviews, and begin to believe they are stakeholders in someone's life. So when death or crisis enters the picture, the public doesn't respond like an observer. It responds like a participant. It demands explanations, assigns motives, and treats private legal structures like public plot devices. That is why fortune distribution stories keep escalating. They are never really about distribution. They are about entitlement colliding with privacy. In a situation like this, the most dangerous phase is the gap between the headline and the paperwork. That gap becomes a marketplace. Every creator, commentator, and tabloid-adjacent outlet competes to fill it with what really happened. And because estate administration is slow, those narratives often outrun reality. People confuse the absence of confirmation with confirmation of wrongdoing. They assume that if a family isn't speaking, it must be hiding. But silence is often the only rational move when legal exposure is possible and emotions are volatile. One careless sentence can turn into a claim of undue influence. One casual "he would have wanted" can become ammunition in a contest. A competent legal team will always advise the same thing. Do not narrate an estate while it is being administered. Yet the public interprets restraint as drama. Now, consider how shock can be manufactured even if the distribution is ordinary. All it takes is a single rumor that someone is excluded, or a single insinuation that a major portion is going to charity, or a single vague claim that an insider says the family is furious. Once that spark hits, the story becomes self-sustaining. Viewers aren't just waiting for facts, they're waiting for emotional payoff. They want a villain and a consequence. They want someone to be punished and someone to be vindicated. And if the estate doesn't provide that, the audience will. It will produce one out of fragments: a resurfaced interview clip, an old family photo, a quote stripped of context, a timeline chart that looks persuasive because it is neatly formatted. This is where HLLW can be both compelling and responsible, by emphasizing mechanism over accusation. You don't need to claim a specific scandal to explain why these stories blow up. You just need to show the machinery. For example, the most underrated force in estate conflict is not greed, it's humiliation. People can accept "I got less." What they struggle to accept is "I got less" because the structure assumes I can't be trusted. Even if the structure is protective, it can feel like a character judgment written in legal ink. And when beneficiaries feel judged from beyond the grave, they often lash out. Not always through court, but through proxies, leaks, friendly reporters, anonymous quotes, online narratives. Litigation is expensive and risky. Narrative warfare is cheaper and faster. That's why distribution shocks Hollywood. Headlines often appear before any formal dispute. They're a form of pressure. They're an attempt to shape perception before a judge ever sees a page. Another underrated force is fear. Fear that control will be consolidated in one branch of the family. Fear that legacy decisions will be made by someone who doesn't share the same values. Fear that money will be used as leverage. Fear that the estate is being managed in a way that slowly erases certain people from the story. In celebrity families, erasure is worse than poverty. Poverty is private. Erasure is public. If someone believes they're being edited out of a legacy, they may react as if their identity is being stolen. That reaction can look irrational from the outside, but it's logical in an industry where reputation is currency. And then there is the broader Hollywood context. Estates can influence more than families. They can influence deals. If a catalog of rights is involved, studios and platforms may be waiting for clarity before greenlighting projects. Agents may be positioning clients. Producers may be circling with authorized pitches. The estate becomes a gate. When a gate is uncertain, the industry stalls. That can create real shock inside Hollywood. Not emotional shock, but operational shock. People realize that one set of signatures will determine what projects can exist, what archival footage can be used, what biographical narratives become marketable, and what stays locked away. If the plan is tight, it may also be intentionally resistant to opportunism. A strong plan anticipates that the moment the person is gone, everyone will arrive with a story and a contract. It might require unanimous approval for certain legacy decisions, or it might concentrate approval in one neutral party to avoid endless bargaining. Either approach can be described as shocking, depending on who expected access. Those who lose access will call it unfair. Those who keep access will call it necessary. That is the double bind. Any structure produces winners and losers in perception, even if it is balanced in value. So where does this go from here? If this remains a trending narrative, you will likely see a cycle. First, more claims framed as revelations. Then, a quieter period where legal processes continue without public updates. Then, sudden bursts of new information, sometimes real, sometimes recycled, packaged as new developments. And through it all, the most important truth will remain unchanged. The estate will not move at the speed of public appetite. It will move at the speed of enforceability. That's why the most honest way to describe the shock is not as a single dramatic twist, but as the slow realization that celebrity wealth is engineered to resist chaos. The plan, if sophisticated, is not designed to feel good to outsiders. It is designed to survive grief, pressure, and conflict. It is designed to function even when the family is not functioning. And that is the harshest HLLW takeaway. Sometimes the final legacy of a person isn't a filmography or a fortune. It is a set of boundaries. Boundaries that tell the world, in unmistakable terms, where the story ends, no matter how loudly people demand a sequel. And when the world demands a sequel, the estate's boundaries often do something that feels almost cruel in its simplicity. They force everyone, family, friends, and spectators, to live with incomplete information. That incompleteness is not a bug. It is a feature. Privacy is an asset in itself, and sophisticated estate planning treats it as something worth protecting, even at the cost of public misunderstanding. In Hollywood, misunderstanding is rarely tolerated because it threatens brand. But in estate administration, brand is secondary. The trustee's job is not to reassure an audience. It is to execute a plan and defend it if challenged. This is where the shock starts to evolve into something more enduring, a power struggle over legitimacy. Legitimacy has two versions in these stories. There is legal legitimacy, what the documents say, what the statute allows, what a court would enforce. And there is social legitimacy, what people feel should happen, what they believe is deserved, what they interpret as loyalty. Those two versions often collide. A person can be socially beloved and legally limited. Another can be legally empowered and socially resented. When those roles split, the public reacts as if justice has been violated, even if the plan is perfectly standard. That emotional reaction is predictable because audiences confuse fame with public ownership. They assume a celebrity's final decisions should align with the public's sense of the celebrity, not with the private complexity of their life. But an estate plan is not a popularity contest. It is a risk map. The risk map approach becomes especially visible when you look at how the plan might treat different categories of assets. Most people talk about the fortune as if it were one pool. In reality, it is multiple pools moving under different rules. Cash and marketable securities can be distributed relatively cleanly, but even those can be staged for tax and risk reasons. Real estate requires valuation, title transfer, and sometimes sale decisions that can trigger conflict immediately. One person wants to keep the house, another wants liquidity, a third wants to rent it, and a fourth believes the house itself is a symbol that must remain in the family. Business interests often cannot be split casually. LLC operating agreements can restrict transfers, require consent, and assign voting control differently from economic benefit. Someone may receive income without control or control without a large personal distribution, depending on what the plan prioritizes. Intellectual property and rights-based income can be the most emotionally loaded of all because they govern legacy. When people argue about royalties, they're often arguing about identity. Who gets to authorize the official narrative? Who can approve a film adaptation? Who can license a name? Who can open the archives? Money is the visible surface. Legacy control is the deep current. If Hollywood observers are shocked, it may be because the plan treated legacy control as more important than equal distribution. That is a plausible move for a person who understood how quickly an image can be monetized after death. Some estates centralize control to prevent exploitation. Others distribute control to prevent dictatorship. Either method can produce backlash. Centralized control looks like favoritism. Distributed control looks like gridlock. Both can be defended as rational. Both can be attacked as cruel. And then there's the question of why a plan would be written in a way that invites backlash. Sometimes the answer is obvious. The person anticipated conflict, not necessarily because the family is bad, but because grief transforms people. It makes some cling and others withdraw. It makes old resentments feel urgent. It makes opportunists smell opportunity. A careful planner assumes that emotions will spike and that outsiders will press in. So the plan is written like a fortress: fewer discretionary doors, tighter distribution rules, clearer trustee power, stronger confidentiality, and multiple contingencies. That fortress design can create the impression that someone expected betrayal. Again, the public reads it as paranoia. But from the perspective of someone who spent decades navigating Hollywood contracts and reputational storms, it could be simple realism. When pressure hits, the structure must hold. Now comes the part that makes these stories linger. The plan can be interpreted as a final judgment. Even if it was not intended that way, people will treat it that way. If one beneficiary is placed under more restrictions, the audience imagines there must have been a reason. If another is given authority, the audience imagines a reward. If a large portion is directed outside the family, to philanthropy, staff, institutions, the audience imagines rejection. Every clause becomes a psychological Rorschach test. But estate plans are not written like diaries. They are written like tools. They may reflect private realities, but they are primarily built for function. Tax efficiency, creditor protection, privacy, timing, and enforceability. The real drama emerges when function collides with pride. Pride is what makes people test boundaries. If someone feels minimized, they may look for a way to challenge. If they feel excluded, they may search for leverage. The two most common leverage paths are legal and narrative. Legal leverage is expensive and slow. Narrative leverage is fast and contagious. That's why you often see sources speak before any filing is public. Narrative is the opening move. It pressures trustees, influences public sentiment, and signals to other stakeholders, agents, studios, publishers, that there is controversy which can change deal dynamics. In other words, the estate becomes a bargaining table. The audience may never see that table. They will only see waves: rumor, denial, silence, new details, and silence again. But inside, the estate is doing what complex estates do: accounting, valuation, risk review, compliance, and strategic communication through counsel. And that brings the story to its most unsettling truth. The shock is not an accident. It is the predictable byproduct of a system built to prevent chaos in a world that monetizes chaos. Hollywood profits from spectacle. Estates profit from stability. When those incentives collide, the public will always feel like something is being hidden, because stability looks like secrecy from the outside. So the question becomes less who got what, and more what kind of legacy machine was built. And who gets to operate it? That is the HLLW heartbeat. Not scandal for its own sake, but the cold realization that the final chapter is not written in interviews or tributes. It is written in governance. And governance is where Hollywood's illusions go to die.